and good morning, everybody. I would like you all to meet Joel. Now, Joel is a new marketing manager at Brandex, and after a couple of successful years in sales, has transitioned over into the world of marketing. And Joel believes that no one watches TV anymore. People only buy online these days. Everybody, and I mean everybody, is on TikTok, and print advertising is dead. And because of all of this, Joel believes that his business, his brand, need to be digital first because, simply put, it's measurable, it's effective, and it's cheap. Well, I'm going to spend the majority of today's agenda proving Joel wrong. And then, of course, what I'll do is provide a very basic framework on what we do at JVS and what I believe is the right way to plan marketing communications activity. And then just a final thought to reflect on after the webinar this morning. Now, before I dive into proving Joel wrong, I want to put my hands up and say that Joel was me not too long ago. So what I'm really doing through these next few slides is sharing research and insights and learnings that I have taken on board over the last 5 or 6 years since my transition from sales into marketing, and sharing those lessons with you all. So let's go through Joel's beliefs. The first is people don't watch TV. So the question we ask is, do people watch TV? And this is data from ThinkBox, which are a very credible research house in the world of advertising. You can see the source on the bottom of the slides for all of these that are coming up. And what this is showing is that for all adults in the UK, 63.7% of their video viewing time per day is broadcaster TV, so normal TV. And then you can see that 11.2% of all adults' time is spent watching subscription video on demand. So that would be Netflix, for example. And then you can see the wheel all the way around to YouTube at 13%, TikTok, ironically, at 3.5%. If we look at it for just 16 to 34-year-olds, you can see that the mix is quite different. People's viewing habits in that age range are clearly different, but still the biggest share is broadcaster TV at 36.3%. But you can see the impact of things like Netflix and Amazon Prime being bigger in this age catchment, and also YouTube, a much bigger part of the viewing habits of this type of person. But all in all, quite clear from this data, which is very robust, that people are watching TV. And if we take that a step further and we look at where video advertising is consumed, because remember, you can't advertise on Netflix. It's impossible. They don't offer advertising as a service to brands. So where is actual advertising consumed? Well, you can see 91% of that is consumed on normal broadcaster TV. And again, separating it with the younger age groups, yes, slightly smaller, but still 77% of video advertising in the UK last year was consumed on the big screen in your front room. And that is a very, very important point. Yes, viewing habits are changing, although TV is still the biggest, but actual advertising is still consumed primarily on TV. What about social media then? Is everyone on social media? So here's some data from BI Intelligence. Admittedly, it's a couple of years out of date, but this won't have changed dramatically in the last couple of years as an overall number. And you can see here that of all adults in the UK, the weekly reach, so the weekly usage of social media broadly, is about 2/3, 64%. And you can see again by the different age ranges across the bottom what the usage is by those groups. Almost every 16 to 24-year-old is on social media, unsurprisingly, but actually only about 24% of people aged 65 plus use social media at least every week. And for some of us on this call, that's a very important, probably our largest customer group. If we break it out even further, you can see it's different source. This is emarketer.com, but it's very similar numbers, but separated by the different social media channels. And you can then start to see, well, Facebook is clearly a platform that appeals to an older person as well as younger people. But we all know that younger people are using platforms like Instagram and Snapchat, etc. The point really here is that whilst a lot of people are on social media, not everyone is on social media. And it's a belief from a lot of marketers that I meet in the business that I run today, believe everybody is on social media all the time. And it is just not true. Is print/traditional advertising dead? Again, this was one of Joel's statements on the first slide. This time I'm referencing probably the most trusted research house in the world of advertising effectiveness, a company called Ebiquity. And what I should have said is that all of these research papers are available online, and I will provide links to all of them in the presentation that you receive a little bit later on today. So back to Ebiquity, you can see here that if we were, so what they did, sorry, is they asked advertisers and agencies which channel they felt was the most effective for advertising, with lots of different criteria, but for simplicity, overall, which channel is the most effective? And of the advertisers and agencies that were asked, they ranked number 1 was TV, number 2, online video, number 3, social media, so digital channels, and they had magazines, newspapers, and generally print very low down the effectiveness chart. Then Ebiquity looked at the data. So they went back over previous campaigns, both good and bad, trying to figure out, right, on the actual real life campaigns, what did the evidence say? Which channels were the most effective? And other than TV, which the advertisers got right, they got everything else spectacularly wrong. Actually, radio and then print, newspapers and magazines are all the 4 top most effective marketing communications channels. This is true, at least in the UK, but a lot of these results can be extrapolated into other markets. And actually, social media, online video, and online display, the data says, the evidence says they're the least effective channels for marketing. This, again, a study only ran a couple of years ago. What about online e-commerce? And you've heard me talk about e-commerce on this forum. I'm a big advocate for direct-to-consumer. I think it's a great channel and initiative to drive decent profit growth in most businesses. And you can see here, the ONS reports this data every month. And since 2011, 10 years ago, online or internet as a percentage of total retail has steadily risen. And then we know COVID happened last year, and that's taken the number up towards, well, above 30%. Actually, most experts now expect it to level somewhere around 30% as retail opens. Undeniable trend and a huge growth, accelerated growth in the last couple of years. But flip this chart on its head and it tells you this, that 70% of sales are still offline, right? So there is undeniably a trend towards e-commerce and internet retail. But when you look at the facts, 70% of all retail products sold in the UK are still bought in physical bricks and mortar stores. Yes, the journey might include some Googling and some going on Amazon and some reading some reviews, but actually the money is changing hand at least 70% of the time in a physical store. And again, this will look quite different dependent on the product category that you sell and also your customer. So very important that. And then finally, his sort of Joel's conclusion based on his beliefs is that digital advertising is cheap, effective, and measurable. And this is all of these slides are firm favorites of mine, but this piece of research done very recently, this was done last year by Lumen Research, is my favorite in this deck. And what they have done is they have taken the attentive seconds that viewers actually watch adverts for. So not how many impressions or how many times that ad is served to an audience, you know, and how many people are seeing it in their newsfeed and maybe watching a couple of seconds. What they've actually done through a huge piece of research is figured out, right, how much does it cost in each of these different marketing channels for attentive seconds? And what you can see here is that TV for a 30-second spot is about £1.05p for 1,000 attentive seconds, compared to digital display on desktop that is £21.88. That makes it 20 times more expensive to advertise digital display via desktop than versus TV. Interesting data here on YouTube. And as I'm going to come on to explain, I am not against digital advertising. I think it is a very powerful channel used in the right way. What I'm saying here is that the digital first approach is not necessarily the right one. Furthermore, some of you will know that the digital advertising world is pretty much owned by Facebook and Google, and Amazon are now coming to the party in recent years, but they mark their own homework. So this was a really big news story in 2016 where Facebook were caught overstating video metrics. So how many people watched your video, how long they watched it for, etc., by 80%. So the result you thought you were getting, actually, it was about 5 times less than what it was telling you. And we've seen loads of these examples come through the likes of Facebook and other social channels and Google and others. And the final point here on all of this is that there is something called click fraud, which is rife in the world of digital advertising. And this is basically bots, so robots that are clicking on ads to make performance look better. So yes, cost of entry into digital advertising is undoubtedly more accessible than, say, TV. You can do an advert on Facebook for £5. It's going to be very difficult to get a TV campaign away for that type of money. But when you actually look at the impact it's having, coupled with they mark their own homework, and actually a lot of the results are robots, not humans, you have to ask the question, is it really that cheap, effective, and measurable? So what fuels these misconceptions, the Joels of these worlds, and me, 5 or 6 years ago, what fuels our digital first misconceptions? And I think the most important part of this is that we assume, marketers, and I think all people in business assume we're our customers. And in most cases, we're not. We don't think like them. We don't behave like them. Our viewing habits are different. How we shop is very different. And most importantly, our view on our own brand is entirely different to the customer's view of your brand. So we have to get out of this mindset that we are the customer, because we're not. We're actually the worst people to appraise our own businesses. We've got to focus on the customer. Secondly, this might go down as a little bit controversial if there's any agency people on the webinar, but I know from my own experience that agencies are incentivized to push digital for a couple of reasons. One, it makes them look modern and forward thinking and innovative, but they also make more profit on digital advertising. They charge higher fees because they claim that it is a more resource intense activity, which I don't question that it is, but I know for a fact that agencies are making more money on this type of activity versus traditional advertising. So that must be considered, and it's part of this misconception, because pretty much all marketing teams that start investing in advertising and media have to almost definitely work with an agency. The final point, just as important, I'd say, as the first two, is we have this inherent mistake for treating a trend as the majority of the market. We see some people, and probably ourselves, using Netflix, and we assume no one else watches any TV at all. Or we buy everything ourselves on Amazon, and we assume no one goes to Currys or B&Q anymore. And based on the data, it's just not the case. And we have to be very careful that we don't mistake what is definitely happening over the long term as a trend. And some of those trends are being accelerated by macro effects. It's not, in most cases, at least for today, the majority of the market. So I've gone off on a bit of a rant about why digital first is absolute nonsense, in my opinion. But I want to provide a little bit of value as well as just the ranting on what I would suggest you do instead. And the first thing is go back to marketing fundamentals. There are two things that matter when planning a marketing campaign or a year of marketing communications activity. The first of those is the customer. And I've talked about this on previous webinars. Who they are, demographically, what their attitudes are towards things like sustainability, use of plastic, what their attitudes are towards things around the home, and also how they behave both with those products in the settings and also through the shopping journey. And then, of course, what are they buying? When are they buying? What are the triggers? And where are they buying from? But ultimately, what you're trying to figure out is who is your target customer or group of customers, because that is inherently important when it comes to designing creative, so the content that goes into the channels, and then, of course, picking the right marketing channels. Then the second thing is the objective. Like, what are you trying to achieve? Now, you might have a amazing brand awareness. Everyone knows who you are in the UK, but your market share is tiny because people aren't buying your product. And that would dictate the type of marketing activity you need to do versus a company that has really strong sales and awareness, but only in a very small subsegment of the customer base for the whole market. They would need to do something very different. They'd need to go and drive awareness and interest with other customers in the market. So you can't pick, and subsequently the channels are all good for different elements of that funnel, what the objective is. So you have to be led by what the objective is, as well as the customer. And coming back to the customer, when we go through the customer journey, then I always use this very simple framework of separating it into two parts. The two parts are separated by the trigger. So what happens in a customer's life to move them from, I'm not in market to buy a new lawnmower or a new set of kitchen knives, to I need a new set of kitchen knives or I need a new lawnmower. Typically the product's broken, they've moved house, the sun starts to shine, whatever that trigger is. And before that trigger happens, they're out of market. And this is what we would define as a brand play. Like, what we're trying to do when a customer is out of market is make them aware of us, or continue to keep our awareness high, make sure our image is what we want it to be, and it's a positive image. And then when they're coming into needing to buy a product or buy from our category, they have a preference towards us, because that means that once they get into market, we're in the consideration set. We're in the 3 brands that they would consider when they're buying a new TV, for example. We then have to convert that consideration, of course, into sales. But the customer journey is very important when thinking about, right, which marketing channels should we use? And if we come on to channel selection, again, using our fundamentals of customer and objective, what you can see here, again, more data, is a very famous study done fairly recently in the IPA. And this is showing you, for all the different marketing tactics available, how effective they are for driving the brand side, so awareness and image and preference, versus how effective they are at driving sales activation. So for example, you can see here that direct response TV is the most effective channel based on this research for driving sales, but not very good at driving brand. Whereas sponsorship is fantastic for building brand, but not so great for sales. And coming back to the example from the previous slide, if you're a company that has really, really high awareness in the market, which you can measure through research, then you probably don't need to invest more money, at least, in things like sponsorship. But if your sales rates are really low, you may want to look on this side of this table at channels and the tactics that can drive immediacy of sales. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because the age-old debate in this world of advertising is, should you invest in brand or should you invest in activation? And that typically translates into, should you invest in traditional media versus digital media? And the most important thing here is that you need to stop thinking in this or that language and shift that to and, because you need to do both. You need to invest in building your brand, which is demonstrated here with this orange line. And you also need to invest in driving sales for tomorrow, which is the yellow line. And what you can see here again on this IPA slide is that these two types of activity have a very different effect on sales over the short term, which is yellow, and then over the long term. And if you imagine that yellow line being pivoted to be in line with the brand building line, that's where you're going to get the best effect, where you're building the base of demand through brand building activity, and then also activating that demand through sales promotions and activation. There are just a few more points on this. I'm going to go into some detail because I think it's important. The first consideration is that typically 1 + 1 = 3 in the world of Marcom's marketing communication, sorry. So doing TV and paid search at the same time is going to give you a result bigger than doing them separately at different times. So that's point number one. Point number two is something called S-curve theory. So this is the idea that you have to spend a certain amount of money to have any impact in any channel. So you have to spend a certain amount of money in TV to have any impact, and then that will go up quite quickly, but then you'll start to get diminishing returns. So should you invest, to use a wild example, £100 million in TV? Well, no, because you're not going to get the same return as, say, investing £500,000 or £1 million in TV. So there is a minimum threshold and a point of diminishing return in all channels. And then finally, with all this wonderful theory and structure and research and data and graphs, we have to then caveat all of it by saying humans are incredibly irrational, and thus the markets are incredibly complex. Like, you can't plan for every eventuality. Customers will come in and into market, out of market. It doesn't matter how great our funnels are. It doesn't matter how well spread our marketing activity is. You cannot predict how humans are going to behave. So always bear that in mind with your planning and then measuring performance. So normally I finish with 3 key takeaways, but there really is only one today, and that is to be neutral. Don't go into a planning process thinking we need to be a digital first company, at least from a marketing perspective, because what I'm not talking about here is internal shared services or any of the other stuff that your business is undoubtedly doing to become more efficient through digital tools. I'm talking about marketing here primarily. And when you go into that planning process for a campaign or for the quarter or for the year, go in with customer and objective first, and that will steer what media channels you should use to deliver against your customer and ultimately your commercial objectives. And the acid test that I always share with clients, and I've used this for years, whenever you're unsure, is ask yourself these 2 questions. Why are you doing it? And ultimately, what is the value of doing it? And I think with that acid test, you should hopefully help to keep you on the right track. Thank you very much. As always.